Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the 64th webinar in the Offshore Wind series, Learning from the Experts. I am John Berneker, Director of NYSERDA's Transmission Center of Excellence, and it is my pleasure to be joined today by today's expert, Dr. Oliver Stover. Before I introduce our speaker, a few reminders for participants and some background on this webinar series. Next slide, please. Firstly, if you are experiencing any technical issues, please contact Adam Hauk at the email address on the bottom of this slide. This webinar is being recorded, and the recordings and presentation slides for all webinars in the Learning from the Expert series are available on NYSERDA's website at the address on this slide. All participants have been muted. We will have time for Q&A following the presentation, so please use the Slido feature to submit your questions. Next slide, please. New York State is working to advance the responsible and cost-effective development of offshore wind as part of a diverse energy supply. Offshore wind is a critical component in achieving the state's energy reliability and decarbonization goals. While offshore wind has provided clean energy to other parts of the world for several decades, this industry is brand new to New Yorkers. To provide interested stakeholders and members of the public with accessible and partial information and opportunities for engagement on specific topics of interest, NYSERDA is hosting this educational webinar series called Learning from the Experts to connect the public with independent experts in key topics in offshore wind. We endeavor to select Learning from the Expert speakers based on their expertise, not necessarily for an alignment of opinions with NYSERDA or with the state of New York. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter. Next slide, please. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Oliver Stover. Oliver is a principal in CRA's energy practice with over 10 years of experience in energy modeling, forecasting, and risk management, specializing in resource adequacy and the application of AI techniques to energy systems. He provides strategic consulting services to utilities, investors, and grid operators, advising on resource planning, reserve margins, and load forecasting. Dr. Stover holds a PhD in civil engineering from Vanderbilt University and a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering from Cornell University. I will now hand things over to our speaker.
Thanks, John, and really pleased to be with you all today. As John mentioned, I work at CRA in our energy practice, and I'm a consultant that works in the resource adequacy space. Today, I'm going to share with you the findings across 3 studies that looked at potentially how offshore wind can be used as a tool to meet growing grid stress. To do this analysis, we jump to the next slide, even one more. Drew on my background as a resource planner. I'm relatively new to the offshore wind space and really came from this perspective as somebody who does resource planning. We're helping utilities figure out what's the right grid mix to meet their objectives, one of them being grid reliability, and recognizing how do we think about this in a holistic way. Specifically, when I came to this task, we looked at the role potentially that grid planners and policymakers can use offshore wind in a number of ways. So if we go to the next slide, we looked at kind of 3 particular aspects that we wanted to evaluate the potential role that offshore wind could play. So the first thing we did is we just looked at what's going on. What are some of the national trends? What's some of the pressure that's facing grids across the country? And potentially what can resources like offshore wind, how can they be used to solve some of these emerging challenges? The next thing we looked at is specifically in the New England and New York context, recognizing that kind of behaves slightly differently than the rest of the country. And these are spaces where offshore wind is really being looked at as a resource to meet emerging energy needs. And then the last thing that we looked at is even though these are often talked about, offshore wind and natural gas, as sometimes competing resources, we wanted to look at, is that true? And are there ways that these resources can be paired together to provide a more robust and targeted intervention for grids across the country, and specifically in this context in New York. Today, I'm going to present just a high-level summary of our findings, but welcome questions from across the report, and they're all available publicly for anyone who is interested. Jumping into specifically what I'll talk about today, we wanted to get into just first providing background, recognizing that even as the grid is really exciting right now for a number of stakeholders, it's also quite complex, and sometimes we love our jargon and we love an acronym in the energy space. So to provide some background, the first kind of number one topic I'm going to be talking about on the next slide is resource adequacy. What does that mean? It means, do I have enough and the right kind of generation to meet electricity demand across a wide range of grid conditions? So this is basically saying any type of weather, any type of resulting customer demand, do I have enough generation to keep the lights on? And if I don't, grid operators will take emergency action called load shedding, where they intentionally turn off power to maintain grid reliability. This is not something anybody wants, and really this is a huge part of grid planning to make sure that we can keep the lights on while balancing other objectives like affordability and decarbonization goals. Importantly, this is not the same as transmission and distribution planning, which are really most often the common cause of outages, but this is still kind of that top headline issue that often gets talked about. Enough right type of generation to really keep the lights on. However, this is becoming increasingly complex. It used to be a relatively simple problem where I knew with a strong degree of certainty what the load demand was going to be next year, and I could just build a little bit of extra generating fat and I could deal with it. That's no longer the case, and grid planning is getting quite a bit more complex, partly because load is growing, generator outages are becoming somewhat more challenging to deal with, and we're also dealing with extreme weather. So specifically on the next slide, if we look at some of the emerging trends that are really causing grid planners to rethink how we think about the grid, specifically the number one topic of conversation in the electricity space is load growth. We're seeing our economy electrify across the board, as well as onshoring of some key strategic sectors like semiconductors, as well as growth in new technologies like artificial intelligence, driving the need for new data centers, which is placing increased demand for electricity across the whole country. Interestingly, this load growth isn't the same in all seasons. We're actually seeing an even higher increase in winter and summer. So what this means is that in many parts of the country, people are increasingly using electricity to meet their heating needs, as well as adopting electric vehicles, which often have more charging needs in the winter. So we're seeing increased phenomena across the country of both higher load growth and shifting stress toward winter months. Another real factor in how it's changing how we're thinking about grid planning is that the resource mix looks different. Oftentimes, historically, the grid was dominated by very steady and what's called dispatchable generators that I could say, all right, I want you to produce this much, and with a high degree of certainty, it would. But increasingly, we're shifting toward what's called variable generators, so things that are often driven by the weather, solar and wind, energy limited resources like storage, which I have to put energy into the storage resource and it only has so much, and as well as natural gas resources, which have been a great boon in driving down costs and have some of that dispatchable properties, but they are more vulnerable to common cause outages because natural gas generators often are interconnected to a pipeline and rely on that pipeline to get their fuel. So if we see that pipeline have a disruption, it can place greater stress on the grid. That's been recently seen in some of these winter weather events. So that's kind of top of mind as we're talking about grid planning. As a result, the stress looks different than it did in the past. We're seeing stress hours across the year in a way that we haven't seen in the past. We're increasingly worried about extreme weather events, and we're also increasingly worried about the winter. Those are top of mind for grid and risk planners myself, as well as across the country. Another key challenge we're seeing across the industry is because we have so much load growth, because there's so much exciting stuff happening in the industry, we're also seeing that it's increasingly difficult to get some of these key new resources that we need to meet the moment. So key supply chains for things like gas turbines, transformers, and other critical aspects have been slower than we'd like. And it's also been more difficult to add generators than I think the industry would like. People are taking really great actions to deal with some of these challenges, but nevertheless, they're important challenges and kind of facts of life as we're thinking through how do we plan a grid that can meet the moment and meet customers' expectations. The other background I want to give you is some key terms on the next slide that are thrown around in the industry and are really important to understand when you're talking about resource adequacy and kind of understanding what folks are talking about when they're saying this is a resource and how they're using it. So kind of the first topic to highlight is how do we actually measure grid reliability? How do we measure the risk of a load shedding event and say that this is a resource adequate grid? And the number one way folks do this is they perform these quite complex and very important studies where they say, what's the likelihood of a load shedding event? And they measure it using different risk metrics. There are a number of them, all quite good, all quite interesting, but the one I'm going to talk about today is expected unserved energy, EUE. What this means is how much can I expect my load to not go served because I don't have enough for the right type of generation. This is becoming increasingly the gold standard to which we plan grids. The way you can think about this is I want to plan my grid such that I keep this metric very, very low and below some target. For example, if you had how much cash you would keep in your checking account to always be able to pay off your credit card bill at the end of the month, you don't know exactly what it's going to be, so you keep that little extra fat so you're able to always meet the need. The next metric I want to tell you about today and is becoming really important to understanding an individual generator's contribution toward meeting resource adequacy needs is ELCC, or effective load carrying capability. This is kind of the secret metric to understanding how a grid is being valued when it's meeting some of these grid stress events. And it's a 0 to 100% measure that says, okay, this is how much I think this resource can show up during grid stress. Importantly, that doesn't just mean periods of peak load anymore. This is really looking to that next hour and next hour to say that this is a resource that's helping me solve when I have the most stress. And lastly, another metric often used to understand what a resource is doing is levelized cost of energy, LCOE. And this is saying, on average, how much am I paying this resource for every megawatt hour it's producing? This is a really useful metric to kind of give a quick hit and intuitive measure of how much it costs. And it's also been a really useful measure of tracking the cost over time, but it often misses some big contexts that I'll get into today. So kind of one of the key findings of our study is this is a great metric, but has to be taken with a bit of a grain of salt and put into a wider picture when we're really evaluating how resources like offshore wind, as well as other resources, play in meeting resource adequacy needs while balancing affordability and reliability and other goals like decarbonization. Moving forward, the first thing we did when we performed our analysis is we wanted to just look around and see what public information was out there so that we could understand some of the New York dynamics when we looked at some of these challenges, especially the resource adequacy challenges facing the New York grid. So there's been some great work done by the New York ISO. If we look on the next slide of looking at what is some of the emerging challenges facing New York. And they have raised some concerns, along with many other markets across the country, that we're starting to see that uptick in reliability risks and that increasing risks toward winter. So specifically, they've said, okay, starting in the 2030s, we're concerned about elevated load shedding, and we're really starting to see that risk profile shift toward the winter. And some key things that have been highlighted in New York studies, which have all been quite informative, is not only are we getting stressed, our neighbors on which we really benefited from trading with are also getting stressed. And specifically, most of the stress is overwhelmingly concentrated in New York City, as well as Long Island. So that's kind of the first data point that we looked at. And when we looked kind of why New York was saying this, and jumping into the next slide, what were some of the concerns that were being raised as they did these studies, is they specifically highlighted, well, New York kind of has a mismatch of a lot of the ability to build generation is upstate versus all the load is concentrated in downstate. And it can be hard to put new generating resources into those, especially urban congested zone. Also, there's been well-documented risk on, because New York's grid was one of the, I think, the first grid in the country. It's quite a bit older than some other parts of the country, and it also has more fuel stress. So oftentimes it's more reliant on aging and somewhat limited natural gas systems, and often uses quite successfully, presently uses oil as a backup fuel to hedge against these periods of fuel stress, but that places increasing strain on these units and causes them to have higher wear and tear. And the last thing we noted is that there's a bit of a timing mismatch of when we're seeing some of this emerging stress happen with the ability of the grid to bring on new resources to actually meet it. Once we kind of moved beyond just general what was out there and started to get into our own analysis, we wanted to first document, is this true? Does New York really have stress on its fuel system? And we found that is true. Our analysis looked at key regions in New York, as well as the broader New England region, and just looking at the existing fuel systems, as well as accounting for that some of the headroom is being freed up as increasing residential users switch to electricity as their heating source. There is a limited ability to add new electricity generators, specifically from natural gas, without the use of backup fuel. So this is a key limit that we agree is challenging in the region. We recognize that there are upgrades coming and that there are alternative strategies like using dual fuel, but this is a key factor as we understood looking at some of the challenges facing New York. Another factor that we looked into is we talked to a range of natural gas developers and asked, okay, is this supply chain factor true? Is it really difficult to get a new turbine? And they said yes. That currently they pointed at the utilization of their resources about 90%. They're seeing upticks in prices, and there's about, kind of rule of thumb, about 5 to 7 years before one can get a new turbine. So that this is a key factor that folks have to think about as they're planning their resources to make sure that they can get to that perhaps longer than they'd like time horizon as they potentially evaluate adding natural gas resources into the future, and they're fully understanding kind of what are the dynamics out there. We also looked at, if we go to the next slide, how is offshore wind being used in New York now? And we were able to evaluate South Fork wind as a potential interesting case study to see how has this gone and how has this resource been used to harden and resolve resource adequacy challenges. And specifically, some themes that stood out to us is this is a relatively small system, somewhat isolated because it's on Long Island, and was recognized as having transmission constraint as well as fuel constraint. So it's this little pocket that's just a little bit hard to deliver to. So when the Long Island Power Authority put out a request to solve some of these issues, they specifically identified that, hey, this needs to be either a fuel-free resource or it needs to have liquid backup fuel because of some of the challenges delivering fuel to the system. And that's how we've seen the offshore wind resource specifically here be used as this targeted intervention to solve some of these local problems and harden the existing infrastructure that was already there. This has been a consistent theme in the remainder of our work of the potential of how offshore wind can be used to resolve resource adequacy challenges, not necessarily purely as a replacement for existing infrastructure, but as a way to harden and kind of augment existing infrastructure and get ahead of some of these fuel deliverability challenges. The other thing that stood out to us is that this has a pretty decent capacity factor, 46%, quite high, especially when compared to other resources like solar. Certainly recognizing that it's a variable resource. They can't control when the wind blows, but when it does blow, it blows quite often, and specifically it blows often in the winter, which is a great way to kind of harden and meet some of this winter stress. The next thing we looked at on the next slide is started to look at, okay, what are the timing of the offshore wind and how could potentially it play a role? So what we found was that Atlantic-based offshore wind has this profile of quite high generation in the winter months with still material output in the summer, but a dip. We also found that because offshore wind can access higher wind, they're often taller, and they have the benefit of having those coastal steady breezes. They often have a quite material benefit compared to their onshore alternatives. And we also looked at how does this benefit profile compare to, say, natural gas, recognizing that we have some of our modeling capability, we can capture that natural gas has a temperature dependent outage rate that's kind of recognized nationwide and faces stress in getting fuel or has a slightly elevated outage when it's quite cold. When we compared these three resources, the synergies were quite obvious to us. Natural gas had quite a bit of availability more in the summer and was able to meet some of those summer needs, while both onshore and offshore wind were kind of the perfect augment, that they had their periods of greater stress during that winter when the natural gas system was more pressured, as well as being able to use the natural gas system to fill in any of those short gaps we saw in the winter. So this is another theme that emerged in our work. These resources really, while there certainly are some competitive dynamics, they actually are quite natural complement. And in some of our more detailed work, which can be accessed in our report, when you pair them together, they cause the other resource to be more effective at mitigating risk. So these are two resources that, in our mind, have this natural synergy so that grid planners can think about them as paired resources to solve grid risk. The other thing that stood out to us as a potential benefit for offshore wind, particularly when compared to onshore counterparts, is its strategic siting location. This is a resource that can fit really well in some of these transmission and natural gas constrained zones and kind of fit into these load pockets. South Fork being kind of the perfect example of how this could be used as a targeted resource to either delay or entirely offset the need to expand natural gas systems or transmission constrained zones. And this is a theme that came out over and over in our work. And then the last thing that kind of stood out to us is that offshore wind could potentially be used as a hedge against some of this technology risk. Recognizing that it has own permitting uncertainties, so that certainly has to be factored as folks are thinking about this as a resource, but that by creating a more diversified supply chain, as well as accessing, kind of bypassing some of those natural gas constraints, this could be a way to kind of add even more power, especially as we're seeing grid risk. But all of this kind of has to be thought through as folks are thinking, what's the right resource for that? Next, we wanted to really dive into what are the markets saying, especially in New York and New England. So specifically, we look through the lens of ELCC. If we go to the next slide, that's that metric, that 0 to 100 metric, where the market is saying, okay, this is how much I think this resource can help me in solving grid stress. What this means is it's sort of saying, okay, this resource is, say, 100 megawatts, but I can count on maybe 10% of it in those grid stress, so I'm going to count it as a 10% resource if I theoretically replaced it with a perfect resource. These are quite complex calculations, and especially for those motivated, it's worth spending time to understand them. But I'll leave this to kind of the A+ students. The key thing to know is that what an ELCC means is how much would this resource perform when compared to a perfect resource, specifically with solving grid stress. What I mean here is shown in my image on the right. This is kind of a classic load profile in the summer and explains the dynamics of especially solar and storage. So historically, we would say maybe 5, 6 p.m. was my period of greatest load on the system when my air conditioning needs were highest. However, because of solar and storage been really effective at solving this historical period of grid stress, they basically have said, well, now solar's done it. I'm able to generate during that period of time. I can meet demand. Okay, I've charged a storage resource. It discharges after the sun sets. And I've been able to solve it and really effectively help meet those historic periods of need. But now I've kind of shifted the problem later in the day. So historically, say at 7, 8, 9 p.m., now I'm seeing periods of time that were historically easy to meet. Now that's that new period of grid stress. This is the dynamic facing grid planners today. That shift from this is my peak demand to more saying this is my peak stress. This is a really important factor as we're evaluating offshore wind. Does it slot into those periods of grid stress, which are increasingly summer after the sun has set and batteries have discharged, and winter during periods of really cold, as well as long duration really cold, where it's difficult to recharge storage. I've got stress on my fuel systems, as well as very high electricity demand. When we actually looked at what the markets are telling us, if we kind of go on the next slide, New York's market, as it's put out its ELCC numbers, is increasingly said that offshore wind wins among renewables. This makes sense. It's got a higher capacity factor, it's got greater generation over all years, as well as that kind of key winter contribution. However, of note, New York ISO is still evolving its ELCC accreditation. It's still a work in progress. And one of the things that they're fully working to capture is that stress on fuel systems, which is increasingly becoming a factor as folks are understanding stress. So if we move to the next slide and look at what do other markets tell us and kind of what's the signal being put out there for offshore wind. ISO New England does do a really good job of capturing that fuel stress and kind of can give us that more deep dive information of how offshore wind does and how does it compare not only to other renewables, but more traditional generating resources. And they also do something interesting where they look at multiple snapshots in the future and they say, not only at this level of offshore wind, but at a range of outcomes, what could happen. So they looked at 3 futures, one with quite high offshore wind investment and one with lower. And the things that stand out to us is that first tranche of investment, offshore wind, is incredibly effective. Its ELCC is quite high, and in fact, comparable even to a gas resource because it's really slotting in that period of stress. Even when the gas resources are stressed, because that's when offshore wind is quite effective, its ELCC is high. However, it shows that as we invest more and more, offshore wind, similar to solar, kind of becomes a victim of its own success. It's able to effectively solve those high wind hours and shift the periods of greater grid stress to when the wind is lower. And this starts to show up in that scenario 2, which is shown in gray here. And you still see that the offshore wind accreditation is high, higher than onshore, higher than solar, but it starts to decline relatively quickly. So this is an important factor that again emerged in our analysis that we independently affirmed. Very effective and sometimes even competitive with a dispatchable resource, especially for that first tranche of investment, but starts to decline quickly. So this is important information as grid planners start to think about, okay, where does this make sense and what's the right amount of investment? And can I potentially pair it with other types of resources like storage so that I'm getting the best out of both of those resources? And then lastly, when we kind of deep dive into even taking it one step further, and moving on to the next slide and performing a number of quantitative analysis, and one forward, what we did is we performed kind of a pseudo integrated resource plan. What that means is we looked at New York ISO system. We didn't just take one resource, but we looked at the grid mix as a whole, and we looked at a range of futures, and we looked at a range of metrics, both resource adequacy, cost, emissions, and others, to look at how does this grid work as a whole, and potentially how could offshore wind play a role in context with the existing resources that are there. The first thing we found is we agree with New York ISO's outlook. New York City is facing elevated risk in our view. We get slightly different kind of timing and exposure on that, likely different to slightly different assumptions. But come to the same conclusion, and that's because of the challenges of that's where the load growth is happening due to electrification, as well as some of the constraints on the ability to import from the wider regions. The second thing we found is that offshore wind's kind of profile does actually have synergies with when emerging stresses, whether winter, kind of in the broader New York City range. We also found kind of remaining summer risk, but offshore wind was able to have synergies with other technologies and kind of fill in emerging gaps. We did find also that if you look at metrics like levelized cost of energy, that kind of magic top line dollar that most folks point at, offshore wind is less competitive. But as we dug deeper into the cost context, we've kind of missed the role that either offshore wind or natural gas or storage, some of these higher ELCC resources can play. So that was one of our key findings. LCOE, great metric for capturing trends over time, but doesn't actually capture some of these other factors like benefit to reliability that are needed to really look at what role is a resource playing, or even how cost effective a resource is within the context of a wider grid plan. And lastly, we found similar results to ISO New England. Offshore wind is quite competitive and potentially as competitive on a reliability perspective as a natural gas plant, depending on the context, depending on the technology, but that it declines over time. So this is important context as grid planners are thinking through, do I want to use this resource? How much? They can find that sweet spot where it's the most effective. How we did our analysis, if we go forward, kind of the key thing we did is we did one of these load shedding studies. We basically said, I'm going to shock a large number of weather conditions. I'm going to capture stress on fuel systems. I'm going to look at a wide range of wind generation profiles, and I'm going to make sure that all that's correlated with each other so that I can really look at what are the risks facing this grid, when are those risks happening, and what part of the state. We also looked at a range of import assumptions because we recognize that New York really benefits from the ability to import, that this is a risk as these surrounding regions are also facing stress. And the next thing we did is we also tried to compare offshore wind to other technologies. We recognize on the next slide that it's not as simple as just saying, I'm going to pick this resource. It's really more saying, I'm going to pick this resource, but I could have also picked these resources, and understanding what role it plays and how it compares to its peers. And hopefully, we hope to give information to help policymakers understand how these technologies play in a New York context and kind of what is the right balance of resources that can help meet some of the emerging needs. When we actually got into our result on the next slide, we looked at, one of the first things we looked at was what is potentially some of the stress on the fuel systems, recognizing that this is a key risk in the region, and potentially how could offshore wind help in some of these challenges. So what we did is we took New York ISO's load profile and we added in electrification of heating and EVs, a critical part of what we recognize is happening in the future that New York ISO is projecting. And we looked at how much more stress would this play on the use of oil-fired resources. While this is not like a traditional risk metric, we think this is an important factor because this has a number of kind of negative outcomes using oil. Number one, it's more expensive. It's more expensive than fuel-free resources or natural gas. Second, it increases the burden on your units. Your generators don't always, they're very reliable. It's a very effective strategy, but there is that slight uptick in wear and tear on the resources. So if we're really running them more and more on oil, it could cause there to be kind of increased stress in the units, perhaps caused faster than we would like retirement for some of these aging resources. And lastly, there's an emissions factor. These are higher emission fuels, so we want to understand that context. And then lastly, there's a reliability factor. These often have limited storage on site, and as soon as they flip to that oil resource, the generator is asking to get refueled from trucks. So if we're on oil for a long period of time, it could create kind of strain on the system across the board, as well as could create kind of logistic headaches as I try to refuel that system. So the first thing we noticed is that if we don't add a winter resource, as we add more of that winter load, we're using oil more. This makes sense, quite a bit more, in fact, if we look at the y-axis on these two graphs. So the more electrification of heating, often because of consumer preference and decarbonization goals, we're using those backup resources more. However, on the x-axis, if we add more and more offshore wind, or similarly even onshore wind could be used in a similar way, because it has that strong winter profile and is often correlated with those periods of coldest time period, we're able to offset that increase. We also kind of very clearly see that declining benefit as well. That first tranche of investment is very effective. It really is the most effective per megawatt of driving down oil usage, and it starts to decline over time. And we see kind of a tipping point about 4 or 5 gigawatts, well beyond the current tranche of investment, but perhaps important information as we're looking at how much of this resource makes sense, as well as potentially the ability to pair it with other resources like storage so that it continues to have benefits beyond that initial tranche of investment. The next thing we wanted to look at is how well does offshore wind do compared to other technologies on a reliability perspective. And the way to read this graphics is I looked at my 4 scenarios. So base case, current technology projection with offshore wind, no alternatives. What if I just canceled the wind plants and didn't build anything to replace it? Renewables only. What if I built only onshore renewables but put them out in New York, recognizing that I can't build an onshore wind plant in New York City? Or what if I replaced it with a gas plant within the kind of downstate region? And we did this for 2032, 2036, and then as well as a sensitivity we'll discuss about shortly. So the 2 bar charts on the left axis, we looked at how much unserved energy would I have kind of out of all my energy sales. We really want to target this to get to less than 10 to 20 ppm of energy would I ever not serve. And what we found was that the risks were real, that New York faces stress kind of as we expect and as the ISO is projecting. When we looked at which 2 concepts performed the best, offshore wind and natural gas had equivalent performance. In fact, offshore wind was able to, in this case, perform slightly better. And that was likely based on how we sized the gas plant, the technology we used. But really we found that it was able to kind of recreate these reliability properties of the natural gas resource, specifically because it was in the most constrained zones, New York City and Long Island, and because it had that winter profile. We found that the worst outcome was not building anything. This makes sense. If you've got growing stress, delaying the ability to bring new energy just increases that stress. And we also found that a renewables only strategy, while helpful, was not quite as effective as an offshore wind or gas strategy, specifically because much of this was solar, which has a summer profile, not kind of the emerging stress hour, and because it was out of state rather than in these key stress, or upstate rather than these key stress zones downstate. The other thing we tested is what if we stopped the grid from being able to import from the surrounding zones, and found that that was a real source of stress. While having native investment, specifically in New York City or Long Island, was orders of magnitude stronger and can be able to hedge against wider interregional stress. We don't, importantly, this is just a stress test. We don't think this is going to actually happen, but it's important information of native investments kind of help New York protect itself against wider regional stress. And then if we go to the next slide, we kind of looked at a number of metrics and tried to see how does offshore wind perform compared to other technologies. And what stood out to us is, like I said, offshore wind had a lot of the resource adequacy benefits of a dispatchable resource, specifically at that lower kind of investment level. It was also able to drive energy prices down and emissions down, just like an onshore renewable resource would do. So that's kind of performed similarly there. And then lastly, if we looked at the capital cost aspect of it, we found that whether natural gas or offshore wind was the most competitive really depended on a lot of context, like the investment level, as well as associated costs, like natural gas pipeline investments or transmission investments, which are slightly outside of the scope of our study and somewhere where we really want to go next as we look at how do you evaluate these resources and compare them in context. And then if we kind of get to the so what and kind of what we found and what were their key themes, we recognize that there's kind of overwhelming what we found. There's no one path to resource adequacy. All megawatts are good megawatts, and all technologies can make sense in a context. And there are certainly benefits of offshore wind and risks. And we hope we found kind of information that can help folks make informed decisions as they understand its potential role in meeting some of the stress. First, we found stress is real. Just like most grids in the country, New York City is facing higher stress than it's seen in the past. Offshore wind kind of sits in that role of having alignment with those stress hours, and it especially can be directly connected to those most stressed zones like New York City and be used to bypass some of these strained fuel systems. We also want to highlight that as folks make these decisions, we really think it's important that they look at the whole context and look at a portfolio as a whole, and kind of make these decisions in a holistic way. Thanks. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Oliver. That was super informative. As we noted at the beginning, we do have some time for Q&A, and please submit your questions using the Slido feature for us to be able to consider them. So just starting off, Oliver, I think you touched on this a little bit, but can you describe the limits of your study and what questions still remain to be answered?
Yeah, thank you. So one, as I kind of briefly mentioned in the beginning, one of the limits of our study is we are really looking at kind of national trends, offshore wind as a whole, rather than specific named projects. Same with natural gas. We think it's really important, and where we'd like to go next is kind of taking it that next dive deeper of looking at this named project, this location. What would the transmission investments be? What would the pipeline upgrades be? We think that's really important in getting the full context. So as folks go next, and I know NYSERDA and New York ISO are doing, really understanding that context of what is that level deeper of the cost and what are the associated implications to get that big picture.
Thanks. I think that leads really well into the next question we have, which is, what about transmission? Could that potentially replace some of the need for offshore wind or natural gas?
Yeah, that's a great question. We certainly have found benefits for transmission. So specifically in our study, when we included the ability to import from wider regions, there's a huge benefit. Talking about kind of orders of magnitude difference in New York City's load shedding risk. However, one of the things we think is really important is to recognize that the ability to import in the past is not the ability to import in the future. So as we're kind of even thinking about transmission, making sure that we're understanding what's on the other end of that transmission line, what's the risk facing them. So another limit of our study is we really looked at New York. We think there's great opportunities for wider regional studies and kind of coordination between these grids to really, A, tell the story of the benefits of transmission, and B, make sure we're not missing any risks that are coming that haven't been seen in the past.
And then how about affordability? Was that considered in your studies?
Yes, certainly. We looked at several key aspects of affordability, energy cost and capital cost, not exactly how that would be passed on to the ratepayer. So we certainly looked at that as well. And we think that's an important factor. Kind of one of those limits of levelized cost of energy is it's just a number and it doesn't get at, well, really, I got to meet reliability. And how much am I paying to meet reliability? So that was kind of one of the key aspects of our study that we hope can inspire others as they're thinking about both reliability and affordability. Those always have to be in context.
And then would any future assessments or next step studies that you're thinking about consider the potential growth of nuclear generation as part of the mix?
Yeah, that's definitely something that we've had in mind. We think that in some ways our natural gas scenario is kind of a good proxy for how a nuclear plant would perform. It doesn't capture that nuclear has kind of other great benefits of not having some of that fuel risk, but that's certainly something in our mind as well. How could it interact with some of these low emissions dispatchable resources?
Right, thank you. So I think we had a couple of questions that it'd be helpful to go back to the slides for. So if we can go back to slide 9 for the first question here. We had one come in asking if you could clarify the concept of load shedding and when that might be necessary.
Yeah, seeing the question, I think I misspoke. Load shedding means intentionally turning off load, not generation. So apologies, and thank you for following up. What this means is basically the grid's kind of electrically unstable because the amount of generation is too close to the amount of demand. And if those don't always match, the grid is quite unhappy. So to maintain stability, what grid operators will do is they'll do rolling blackouts. We've seen this in recent years, and some of those kind of really unfortunately and an important learning for the industry in Texas with some of the winter events where the operator there had to turn off electricity service to customers across the state because they had insufficient generation to meet demand, as well as just wide area pressure on the grid.
All right, thank you. And then if we go to slide 19, we had a couple of questions come in around ELCCs. So the first question, I think may have just been a little bit lost as we were transitioning, but someone asked about this slide 20 indicates ISO New England ELCCs, but when you were talking about your results, you were focusing on New York. So looking at slides 19 and 20, can you first just once again let folks know why you were drawing these comparisons between the LCC values in ISO New England and in the New York ISO? And then also just confirm that when you were digging into those quantitative results towards the end of the presentation, those were New York focused, and as such, the NYSO ELCCs would have been what was involved in that work.
Yeah, thank you. So a couple things to kind of understand. ELCC is definitely the dark magic. So appreciate everyone suffering with us. Every market uses a different formulation. So even as we say general ELCC, every market's a little bit different. So it's important to recognize if I have a 10% in one market versus a 10% in another market, kind of meaningless comparison. What's most important is to compare the relative performance between generators. That being said, some ISOs are more advanced in how they're modeling and capturing emerging grid risk, so they can kind of be a harbinger of potentially what's to come. So New York ISO, as most markets in the country, are evolving and thinking about this differently and capturing different risks differently, with every market kind of doing certain aspects better than others. Specifically, I think ISO New England is a very similar risk profile to New York. So it can be a useful harbinger of potentially what's to come in New York, and as modeling evolves, what might happen. So ISO New England has done a really great job of capturing fuel risk. They have very advanced modeling for what happens if you run into boil, just good stuff that potentially is kind of folks in the industry are watching and kind of can be a good comparison for how offshore wind might behave. And they've also assigned an ELCC for every resource, while New York ISO right now is kind of mostly focused on renewables. So it's just a good kind of, it's not the same, but it's a similar enough system that it can give us information. The next thing to note is New York just does their modeling really differently. So to eat my own words, even an ELCC is usually 0 to 100%. Their modeling is just slightly different, and they're looking at reduction in risk, so they can end up with some wonky results like above 100. Details not super important, and happy to take the conversation offline. The key thing when looking at ELCCs between markets is look at relative performance between technologies. So how does offshore wind compare with a storage resource, compare with a gas resource? And that can kind of give us, oh, this is its effective contribution compared to other resources. And yes, while my general reports that are available publicly look nationally, we ended up doing our deep dive in both ISO New England and New York ISO, and the results I presented were the New York ISO focused, though ISO New England has some good information as a market facing similar challenges with coastal urban regions and winter load growth.
Thanks, Oliver. And I think Lastly, you touched on this a bit, but I think it may be worth repeating. So specifically on this slide in the ISO New England values, we see some that are over 100%. Can you give our audience a high-level idea of why that can happen when looking at these values?
Yeah, so again, every market is slightly different. And even as they use the vanilla term ELCC, every market computes it slightly differently. And we're kind of increasingly moving to different metrics. So specifically, New York or ISO New England uses how much EUE is reduced compared to a perfect resource. And because they're capturing other benefits, and partly because of some modeling specific choices, they can end up with these atypical results. This is an indicative result. I doubt this will likely be, this is likely not going to what's happened in practice. So just a very just quirk of New York ISO's preliminary modeling that will get resolved in the future.
Thank you, Oliver. That was the last question we had come in. So I would like to once again thank you for sharing your work and your insights with us. And to our audience, thank you for joining us for this Learning from the Experts webinar. As a reminder, the webinar recording and presentation slides will be available on NYSERDA's website. Our next webinar in the series will be on May 13th. Philip Basil from North Green Capital will discuss financing structures and risk allocation for port upgrades to support offshore wind, as well as other uses. You can register for future webinars through our events page at wind.nyserda.ny.gov. We also encourage you to check out past webinars in the series on NYSERDA's YouTube channel. If you would like to request a topic or speaker for this series, please email us at offshorewind@nyserda.ny.gov or fill out our Learning from the Experts survey posted on our events. Thank you for joining us today. See you next time.